Over the past decade or so, Viktor Orban's Hungary has developed a bit of a reputation as the troublemaker or bad boy of the European Union. Most other member states disagree with both Orban's illiberal domestic politics and his relatively pro-Russia foreign policy. But the EU has been unable to convince Orban to change course, and his veto power has given him significant sway over the EU's foreign policy orientation. This has become a particularly difficult issue since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which only looks likely to become more acute as the EU moves towards an independent security architecture. However, over the past few days, we've seen a handful of reports that, if Hungary does try to veto efforts to develop an EU security architecture, senior EU officials are looking at how they might actually be able to kick Hungary out of the bloc. So, in this video, we're going to take a look at how Hungary's relations with the EU have deteriorated over time, why the EU will probably need to develop a more muscular security policy, and what might happen if Orban gets in the way. Who's the worst politician right now? Here are thoughts and argue with us on our podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. So let's start with a quick overview of EU-Hungary relations. Because, well, this isn't the first time the Commission and Orban haven't seen eye to eye. Ever since Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban came to power in 2010, the EU has been worried about what's commonly known as democratic backsliding, and has frequently accused Orban of undermining the independence of the judiciary and the media. Tensions came to a head in 2018, when the European Parliament voted to trigger Article 7 of the EU Treaty, which allows the EU to suspend certain rights from a member state. When this didn't go anywhere, in 2020, the EU created a new rule of law conditionality mechanism, which basically allowed the EU to withhold funds from countries that had violated the rule of law, like Hungary. Since then, the EU and Hungary have been stuck at a standstill. The EU is withholding billions of euros in EU funding to Hungary, but Orban has refused to reverse his more controversial reforms. Tensions have also been exacerbated by Orban's relatively pro-Russia position in the Ukraine war. Orban has refused to send aid to Ukraine, resisted sanctions on Russia, and maintained a relatively cosy relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin, even visiting him in Moscow last year. Anyway, when tensions flare between Orban and the EU, more liberal-minded Europeans often call for Hungary to be expelled from the bloc. In the past, we've been pretty dismissive of this idea for the simple reason that there's no legal mechanism to kick a member state out of the bloc. And as much as Orban complains about the EU, he's not going to voluntarily leave anytime soon. After all, the EU serves as a convenient bogeyman, and Orban's veto gives him way more sway over European policy than he would have otherwise. However, this time might be different. European leaders almost all agree that the continent desperately needs a new independent security architecture to cope with both Trump's abandoning of Ukraine and the threat of renewed Russian aggression down the line. While there has been some suggestion that the immediate response for Ukraine could be done outside the EU, the UK, for instance, likes talking about a coalition of the willing that could apparently include Turkey, Canada, or even Australia, a more permanent security architecture to guarantee European security for the long term will probably have to be organised via the EU. This is for essentially two reasons. First, there simply isn't time to set up some new organisation, and it would be far more efficient to use the EU's pre-existing structures. And second, no other new organisation has the EU's fiscal firepower. What we mean by this is that rearming Europe is clearly going to cost a lot of money, but national budgets are already strained. The EU, however, can take some of the strain by stepping in as a borrower of last resort, and can borrow at lower rates than most European countries, thanks to its outstanding credit rating. We saw this earlier this month, when Ursula von der Leyen announced that the EU could borrow 150 billion euros at the EU level to help fund Europe's rearmament, and we should probably expect further joint borrowing in the near future, especially if Trump's trade wars put further strain on the European economy. Anyway, you get the point. Most of Europe agrees that the continent needs its own independent security architecture, and this will probably have to be done at the EU level. However, because foreign policy decisions require unanimity among member states, Hungary has a veto here. Orban has proved willing to exercise this veto in the past. Only last week, Hungary vetoed a joint declaration expressing the EU's support for Ukraine, and EU officials have told Euractiv they expect him to veto the renewal of European sanctions on Russia, which expire on March the 15th. This isn't the end of the world, but if Orban continues to wield his veto so freely, or uses it to stymie moves towards an EU security architecture that the other leaders deem necessary for the continent's protection, senior EU officials are apparently talking about ways to somehow force Hungary out, at least according to reports by Mujtaba Rahman at the Eurasia Group. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, wait a second, I thought you just said there was no legal mechanism to kick out a member state. And well, you're right, we did just say that, and there isn't. However, during times of crisis, the EU has a habit of finding a way, and doing things that aren't obviously licensed by its treaties. During the Eurozone crisis, for instance, the ECB found a way to buy up government debt, despite the fact that Article 123 of the Maastricht Treaty forbids European central banks from directly funding government debt. During the pandemic, again, the European Commission played a big role in negotiating and procuring vaccines, despite the fact that, under current European law, the Commission has no direct competency over health policy, which is supposed to be up to member states. Now, to be clear, we're not saying this is necessarily going to happen, or even that it's likely. One big caveat worth mentioning is that Hungary's economy is really struggling, which means Orban might relent if that means he gets his hands on the billions of euros the EU is currently withholding. Orban is also currently behind Peter Magyar's teaser party in the polls, which means the EU might decide to just wait until the next election and hope Orban's replacement is more amenable. Nonetheless, if the EU does move towards developing its own load-bearing security architecture, a showdown between Hungary and the rest of the bloc looks somewhat inevitable, and history suggests that when the EU is faced with crisis, politics trumps law. Like a lot of things, this whole situation is very much in a state of flux. With Trump breaking international alliances and fundamentally changing geopolitics, the world has certainly felt more stable. Every day we're faced with weird headlines from Trump's trade war with Canada and Mexico, and Elon's not quite so efficient Department of Government Efficiency, or Trump declaring war on Mars to try and regain some international allies. Okay, that one might not be real, but we do dive deep into the chaotic world of US politics in our series WTF USA. That's our series where we explain everything that's happened in the land of the free. With Trump behind the Resolute desk, the number of WTF moments only looks likely to increase. Unlike some of our other series videos, the tone of WTF USA is more light-hearted and takes something of an irreverent look at what's going on. If you're interested, WTF USA can be found exclusively on Nebula. Nebula is also the home to other incredible original content from your favourite creators, like Tom Nichols' Boomers. Discussing everything from generational inequality, housing, the climate crisis, and pensions, the globe-trotting feature-length documentary tries to unpack the questionable legacy of the baby boomers. If you didn't know, Nebula is an independent creator-owned streaming platform that specialises in thoughtful content, from creators like Wendover Productions, Neo, and Real Life Lore. It's not just WTF USA either. You can also watch every normal TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in some instances before they even land on YouTube. If you're not a member already, click our link in the description to get 40% off. We really hope you check out the series, and as always, thanks for your support.